and welcome to the museum with Alden Ferguson and his talk this evening on military aerial reconnaissance in Oxfordshire. We're very grateful to Martin Baker Aircraft for sponsoring tonight's talk, the second time they've done that for us, and Alden will be talking about one of their special places at Chalgrove. If you haven't been to the museum lately, please do try and come by, before Christmas preferably. We do close on December 20th, because we've still got Into Battle. At the moment, the exhibition's going really well, lots of people coming through the door, and we'd really like to share with that as many people as possible. Some of the artwork on display is very well known by an artist called Keith Burns, who is very well acknowledged for his work with aircraft, so please do try and get here. If you're able to stick around for the end of the talk, there is a live Q&A hosted by David Innes, and there is opportunities at all times to make donations. As we always say, it is only with these donations that we're able to continue making these lovely online talks, looking after the collection, and indeed hosting all these fantastic new exhibitions. I hope you have a lovely Christmas and New Year, and we hope to see you next year with our 10th birthday anniversary.
Good evening, everyone. Delighted to welcome you to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum this evening, and following Ursula's helpful introduction, to introduce myself, David Innes. I'm a trustee here, and I'll be hosting the live Q&A, which follows immediately after Alden Ferguson's talk. You've heard Alden Ferguson before. He talked to us as a Royal Air Force historian about the Royal Air Force in Oxfordshire some months ago, and we're delighted to welcome you back now. Alden, I'm going to pass on straight over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. Tonight, it is all about military photo reconnaissance and interpretation and the massive link it has with Oxfordshire. I'm going to split this into two sections. The first part is getting the photographs and how it's done and why. And the second half is what happens to that information once we have it. So it is said, or it was said before the beginning of World War I, that the military organization that has the best photographic intelligence will win the next war. Were they right or were they wrong? Let's see. World War I. How can any commander on the ground, without having access to some form of aerial platform, ever be able to see what's going on behind the front line? The generals in the field from Roman times right up to World War I would have done anything to be able to go to the high ground or higher than the high ground to see what is beyond. So gathering the intelligence, and the very first way they did it to look over those trenches of the First World War was to put a basket underneath a balloon, which was extremely vulnerable. And the only link with the ground was a telephone, and the poor guy up there would have a pair of binoculars, and he would try and spot what was going on behind the line. It wasn't going to work. It was unsuccessful, and they had to do better. So very quickly, the early aircraft which we had, which were unarmed initially, and they were called Scouts. The early cameras were fitted to the side of the aircraft just like this, and they were glass plate negatives. So the poor guy taking the photographs, who was the observer in the back, there's a cockpit in front of him, has to handle this camera. He has to take the glass plates in and out of the camera, expose the film, protect it and put it back into a cover so it doesn't become overexposed. He has to know where he's taking the photograph. The aircraft is vibrating. It could be being shot at, and it could be freezing cold, as it always is at height, and certainly during the war. So the World War I photography had developed very, very quickly indeed, and so did the cameras. And these are typical World War I cameras. You can see the age of the vehicle behind with the solid tires. And slowly these cameras became more sophisticated. They were then mounted actually in the aircraft under the floor or between the legs of the observer in the back, and they could do more and more beneficial work. By the end of World War I, they could take photographs of the whole of the Western Front twice a day. And from those photographs, they could make maps, but also they could see the disposition of the German lines, where the German concentrations were, and how the troops on the ground could mass in the right direction to make an attack, and also for the artillery to determine what were the targets for the artillery. It developed in the war. It got reasonably sophisticated. As soon as World War I ended, it virtually just disappeared. The Air Force was run down to a very, very small cadre. No photographic units were left, and it laid in limbo until the early 30s, when we saw the rise of Nazis and Nazism in Germany. And then this gentleman came along, Sidney Cotton, who is known as the father of photo reconnaissance. He was a maverick. He was quite a character. He was a pilot in the First World War in the Royal Naval Air Service. And after the war, he took people around Newfoundland by air to photograph seals and to go seal hunting. He worked with a company called the Aircraft Operating Company, which part of their films, although that came later. But this company operated from Wembley, and they started to pioneer aerial reconnaissance under the leadership of Sidney. Sidney was a businessman. He developed a colour film process called Dufay Colour, and he was selling this around Europe as well as the UK. And he flew around France and Germany and was doing this immediately prior to the breakout of war for 2 or 3 years. He counted amongst his friends Winston Churchill, the James Bond creator, Ian Fleming, the Kodak boss, George Eastman, so he's really well connected with the photographic business. And he also befriended several high-ranking German officers, including Luftwaffe officers. His work came to everybody's notice, and he was given by MI6 this aircraft, a Lockheed 12A Electron Junior, the intelligence branch of the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, asked if he would be prepared to take pictures from the air. So they bought him this aircraft, and he had it modified, he himself, with cameras underneath in hidden compartments, so that he could overfly Europe and take photographs, particularly Germany, but also other countries as well. From 20,000 feet, his cameras could cover an area approximately 16 kilometers wide. And he had 3 F-24 cameras in this aircraft, one face down and 2 were at 45-degree angles, so they were sweeping up this wide area. He was an inventor in many ways. The bulge on the side of the cockpit here, the teardrop, was his concept and his idea. And of course, there is no point in having a photograph unless you know where it was taken. With this teardrop, he could put his head into that bulge and could look down. And that helped dramatically being able to identify where he was. The aircraft also carried a small Leica reporter camera with 250 exposures. And he had the aircraft paled a pale blue so that it was almost invisible at height. And he had a name for it, which was camo tint, camouflage and a tint. So he had a lot to do with the development and the interpretation of these photographs. His motto, whether it was created by him or not, I'm not sure, is "Thou shalt not be found out." And he was referred to several times as the Cotton Club or the Sydney Cottons Air Force. He flew 15 covert missions over targets in Germany, Italy, and the Mediterranean, including the German naval base at Wilhelmshaven on the 22nd of August 1939. So that's only a few days before war broke out on the 3rd of September. He photographed the German fleet. He was asked by the Admiralty to go back on the 1st of September, 2 days before war broke out and before Germany invaded Poland, but he didn't. But by this time, he could photograph a strip approximately 11.5 miles wide from 21,000 feet. And he gave a very, very valuable service to the RAF, and they actually commissioned him in the RAF to run the first photo reconnaissance units. Now, the RAF were operating aircraft like these to try and do the same job, and they were clearly totally inadequate. The Blenheim on the left, a light bomber, sometimes also used as a fighter, could only climb to 24,000 feet, 7,300 meters. The maximum speed was 266 miles an hour, far too slow. There was no way it could evade German fighters, and it just wasn't going to work. Similarly, the Lysander was a single-engined aircraft, even slower, even lower, and it wasn't going to work. Cotton realized that he needed something far more sophisticated, and he begged and begged and begged for Spitfires. One of the other things which he also developed was a heated suit for aircrew to fly, particularly in unheated or open cockpit aircraft. And it was called a Sidcot suit, Sidcot, Sydney Cotton. And that was used throughout the war by many, many, many people. But he got, after a lot of pushing and negotiating, he persuaded Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, to let him have 2 Spitfires. And this is one of them. You'll see there are no guns on the front of it, and he adapted it by putting cameras underneath. He had 2 cameras under the wings, and then twin cameras, again, slightly oblique, pointing rather than vertically down in the back of the fuselage. He stripped the aircraft down to make it as light as possible, to make it fly as fast as possible, as far as possible, as high as possible. And he took everything out at first, not only the guns, he even took the heating out, and he also took the radio out. At the sort of altitude that these aircraft were going to operate at, it was not going to work. So they had to put the heater back, and clearly they needed a radiator. And they used the heat to blow across the lenses of the cameras, because at height they were going to freeze, because they were in freezing temperatures, most of their sorties. And the motto, which was rapidly attributed by the pilots of photo reconnaissance aircraft, was "Alone, unarmed, but unafraid." The cameras developed. The F-24 camera was the standard camera used more or less throughout World War II. The different focal lengths gave it more better clarity, and the longer the focal length, like the 14 inches on the left, and it got considerably longer, the better clarity, because these aircraft were predominantly operating from height for safety, although they did obviously operate from low level as well. Now, the Sidney Potter was working from an airfield right by where Heathrow is today, and it wasn't going to work because it was too close to London and likely to be bombed. So what they did was move the photo reconnaissance aircraft and formed number 1 photo reconnaissance unit at Benson in Oxfordshire, shown here. And just to orientate you, this is Reading down here, and this is Oxford up here, and between the two we have Benson, and the 2 other bases shown here were later used by the Americans, Mount Farm and Chalgrove. Mount Farm was a grass strip. There is virtually nothing there. You wouldn't really know there was an airfield there today. Chalgrove, of course, is still used by our sponsor tonight, Martin Baker, and it's there that they have 2 of their meteors based, and they do ejection seat trials from there. Now, the interpretation was also done, some in Oxfordshire, some slightly out of it, but RAF Medmenham, which is here on the Thames between Marlow, that's Maidenhead down here, High Wycombe up there, Reading down here. The buildings, which were known as Danesfield, were taken over at Medmenham, and as I'll explain later, the work they did extended to other sites, including Phyllis Court and Hewenden House at High Wycombe. So Benson was the major base, RAF base. It was number 1 photo reconnaissance unit, and there were 4 squadrons of Spitfires based there in the 500 series, 540, 541 to 544. But these aircraft were ranging far and wide. They were ranging up to the north of Norway, as Norway was, of course, occupied by the Germans in 1940, and they were ranging right down to the south of France, to the Spanish border. We needed to know what was going on in Europe. We needed to see everything that was happening. So they had detachments from Benson up at Wick and at St Evell, which is down in Cornwall. And there the pilots would operate, and they would do the early part of the interpretation there before the photographs were sent down to Medmenham. So the aircraft were looking like this. Here is a Spitfire with no ammunition, no guns on it, and you can see the window on this side through which the camera was arranged so they could take oblique photographs and also vertical photographs with the under-wing cameras. Later in the war, once a Mosquito was developed, they also converted Mosquitoes to do photo reconnaissance work. The advantage of the Mosquito was it was bigger, so it could carry larger and more cameras. It also had a crew of 2, so you had a second crew member who could act as navigator and manage the cameras and determine where the photographs were taken. But the 2 continue to operate and continue to be developed side by side. The top one's the PR, the 19 was the ultimate. This is a Mark 19 with the Griffin engine rather than the Merlin engine, and this became the ultimate, and it can fly up to 42,000 feet. Now that's as high as Concorde flew and higher than the average airliner ever flies. And the speed was very considerable as well. They were very effective. The Mosquito was very similar in speed and altitude, and there was very little that the Germans had which could actually get to them. The Americans were so impressed once they joined the war that they also asked for Spitfires and Mosquitoes. And this is a photograph taken at Mount Farm of an American Spitfire, obviously, with the American markings on it. And here are, again, 2 pictures taken at Mount Farm. It was a farm, but it was taken over and used as a proper airfield. And its proximity was very useful, being so close to Medmenham. Chalgrove became another American base for photo reconnaissance aircraft a little later, and the Americans did use their own type of aircraft, which was basically a P-38 Lightning, which was a twin-engined, twin-tail boom, known colloquially as the Fork Lightning, or the Fork Devil, but the name was changed because it was a photo reconnaissance aircraft to the F-4 or the F-5. Initially, all American fighters had the prefix P, P-47, P-38, P-51, and that was pursuit, and then they changed it eventually to fighter. So here at Mount Farm and at Chalgrove, you can see the wing, the opening here for the cameras to be mounted in the nose. Again, a fairly substantial aircraft, which could fly high and fast as well, and it did. And these were the sort of cameras which were being developed throughout the war period. They even developed them slightly so that they could move slightly in the same direction of the aircraft. So that when they were flying at low level, it was to try and reduce the distortion created by speed, because clearly the lower you are, the more blurred a photograph is going to become if you're flying at high speed. So this is a Mosquito, which is in the background here. Here is another Mosquito. Again, no guns in the nose. These aircraft acted as fighters, and they had guns in the nose here. And they also had a bomb bay, but these were photo reconnaissance. Now, the sort of work they did was not just in England, but also in the Mediterranean. And Adrian Warburton here on the left was a wing commander, and again, a loner, but a very, very brave and very effective photo reconnaissance pilot. And he flew a mixture of aircraft, and Spitfires flew to Maryland, twin-engined American aircraft. He carried out over 300 operational sorties from Malta, covering all different aspects of the Mediterranean, looking at the Italian fleet, the Italian airfields, as well as the German ones, all points from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Sadly, he was lost on an operational sortie on the 12th of April, 1944, but after doing wonderful work, and he's recognised for that. The other gentleman, Michael Suckling, was known as Babe because of his very young looks, and of course he is young, he's a flying officer. And his claim to fame was he was the first person to find the Bismarck as a photo reconnaissance pilot flying out of Wick in northern Scotland. And he was flying up there in May 1941. Now, Norway has a big cloud problem all the year round, and the flights were going up from Scotland. They were desperately searching for German shipping and where it was hidden and concealed in the Norwegian fjords. Eventually, he found the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen, photographed it, and came rushing back to Wick, very excited, landed. The photograph was, or a strip of photographs were developed, and before they were even printed, they were interrogating them and checking them, and they agreed, yes, that is the Bismarck. He was then, well, they then notified the Admiralty in London, of course, and they wanted those photographs instantly. No such thing as fax or being able to send them electronically. They had to go manually. So Suckling, poor guy, was given the job to taking them to London. So having been to the north of Norway and risked his life taking these photographs, come back to Wick, he was pushed into a Spitfire with the photographs and said, right, off you go down to Hendon, and these are to be delivered to the Admiralty. He was flying down the country. He got as far as Nottingham and realised that he was running low on fuel, and he came from Nottingham, and he knew he had a friend there with a motorbike and with fuel. So he landed at Nottingham, went running to his friend's house and said, I'm commandeering you and I'm commandeering your motorbike, and we're going to London now. And his friend took him down to London to the Admiralty. Photographs were delivered, and that was it. That's a typical sort of role they were doing. The role was done magnificently, continued throughout the war to determine just what was going on the other side. Now, before I go back down to the interpretation, I'm just going to move on to the Cold War. Again, just like the end of the First World War, the photo reconnaissance squadrons were disbanded at the end of the war. The Air Force shrank dramatically. But of course, the Cold War started very, very soon afterwards. By 1947, we were into it. And as far as the Soviet Union was concerned, they made no secret of wanting global domination. And we had to have a deterrent. But we needed to know what was going on in the Soviet Union. And this, of course, was way before satellites or any such thing. As far as we were concerned, the Soviet Union may as well have been on Mars. We knew precious little. Fortunately, one thing did happen. the Germans, the Luftwaffe, took a lot of photographs of West Russia, Western Soviet Union, and they fell into our hands at the end of the war, and they were used initially as part of the target decisions for bombers in the Cold War should the necessary the need arrive. So intelligence grew out of photo reconnaissance, and the country, as you can see, was absolutely gigantic, 11 time zones. But we needed to know, where are the barracks? Where are the naval installations? Where are the aircraft and weapon factories, the troop concentrations, the training grounds, etc.? Very, very difficult to find out, and we had to find ways of doing it. Coming back to Oxfordshire and the link, during World War II, there were 25 military airfields in the county, as shown here. If you work out approximately 2,000 to 3,000 people per airfield, there were 54 to 60,000 RAF personnel just operating out of Oxfordshire. Many bases, I'm not going to go through them now, but photo reconnaissance, as I showed earlier, revolved around these three airfields during World War II, which was Benson down here, Mount Farm, and Chalgrove. Once the World War II was over and we get into the Cold War, we get the Americans joining with us to create the deterrent. And they took over two Oxfordshire airfields. They took over Bryce Norton and they took over Upper Heyford. And they made major changes to them. Nowadays, in Oxfordshire, we only have two RAF stations. Bryce Norton is now an RAF station, and Benson remains as an RAF station. Upper Heyford, sadly, has gone. So, Cold War, this is RAF Bryce Norton as it more or less appears today, photograph taken last year by Google. The Americans took it over in 1950 and extended the runway to just over 9,000 feet. So it could take any American aircraft which was due at the time or which was available at the time. It was massively extended in terms of the accommodation, the facilities on the base. And the generally what the Allies were trying to do and what NATO was trying to do once it was formed was to detect as much as possible what was going on in Russia. And there were border flights being flown along the east-west border and along the coastline, north and south, wherever possible. And these show the approximate routes taken from Upper Heyford and Greenham Common and Fairford and other American bases in the Midlands of England. They could fly into the Baltic, but had to keep away from both Swedish as well as Polish, because, of course, the Soviet Union was containing Poland and East Germany. So they could fly so far into the Baltic and listen, photograph sideways, interpret radio, radar, and anything else, take air samples looking for radioactivity from nuclear or atomic weaponry. They also flew down the border, East and West Germany, into the Black Sea, and across Turkey and Iran, because it was friendly then, to the bottom of the Caspian Sea as well. And these flights operated from Oxfordshire. And here is an overflight. We had to take risks, and risks were taken. And this one didn't go too far, but to the major naval bases with the Russian Navy is the Kolar Peninsula here. And that's Murmansk, which is where the Arctic convoys went during World War II, and Archangel, which they also went to as well. This is the Soviet border. And this RB-47 overflew this area in May 1954, were attacked multiple times by MiG-17s, but they managed to get away with height and speed. It created all sorts of diplomatic problems, but what it meant is they could take photographs of what was on the ground at Murmansk and Archangel and the points in between. There are, if you go into Google and have a look at this area, there are hundreds and hundreds of inlets. And if you look carefully, you will see Russian submarines today, which are moored and anchored up there. And it's a hybrid of Russian activity. And of course, from there, they have free space to get into the Norwegian Sea and to get into the Atlantic, because obviously the Baltic is controlled really between Sweden and Denmark, and any shipping or even submarines which has got to come out through Skagerrak we will know about. But from here, they can submerge and get into the Atlantic. The sort of aircraft which we were using in Oxfordshire were the Stratojet converted to RB-47. And there are lots and lots of bulges on this. If you look at the bulges underneath here, all sorts of listening and photographic equipment to fly along those borders. And there were incidents, there were lots of incidents. The Martin RB-57, which is the picture on the top there, was the American version of a Canberra. And this was, again, a high-level reconnaissance aircraft. They only operated for a short time out of Bryce Norton. But they did, and this is a flight here in February 1959, where they flew into the Baltic off the coasts of Kaliningrad, Lithuania, Latvia, and of course those countries were all Soviet at the time. They were intercepted. The Russian aircraft flew alongside them, but they escaped. They got the information they wanted, and that was a mixture of seeking radar and radio transmissions, etc., to determine where those radars were, what type, etc. The current aircraft, which is used for most of this role now, is the RC-135, and the very, very early ones did operate out of Bryce Norton. They've been developed considerably now. They're known as the Rivet Joint type aircraft. And in January 1964, two of these were operating out of Bryce Norton into the Baltic. And again, they were intercepted, but they were in international airspace and they were not hit, although they were threatened quite seriously. Now, Bryce Norton, the reconnaissance element out of Bryce Norton moved in 1965 to Upper Heyford. And this is a picture of Upper Heyford taken in 1999. The main runway is covered in cars. If you look at that, and all the taxiways absolutely covered. But like Bryce Norton, it was taken over by the Americans for the Cold War as a major bomber base and extended hugely. All these black dots over here and around here are hardened aircraft shelters. This is fuel installation here, and it was a major, major base. The original hangars, the RAF wartime hangars, are here, but there are masses of additional buildings. It was like a town. From the air, the map shows it looking like this. The original airfield was just within that perimeter right there. It was extended 9,600 feet long, 1.8 miles, 200 feet wide, and it had a massive infirmary, a clinic, obviously bowling alleys, shopping, housing, 5,000 American personnel plus. And the type of aircraft which started to operate here, as well as the bombing role the station undertook, were detachments of U-2s coming across from the States. Now, these were able to fly at great altitude, 70,000 feet, not particularly fast, but when they were built, they were higher than anything that the Soviets could get to with the aircraft or the missiles. But whilst they were based here at Upper Heyford, the RAF decided or agreed to try and intercept them. And it was agreed with the Americans who knew what was going to happen, so it didn't cause a stir. So Lightnings out of Middleton St George up in Teesside went and did zoom climbs, and they found that they could actually get a lock on with their missiles to the U-2. So the U-2s went higher. They started at 60,000 feet, and they went up to a record of 77,800 feet. And still these Lightnings were able to lock onto them. So that caused a bit of a scare. It didn't mean the missiles would get to them, but they stayed over here in Britain until the end of the Cuban crisis, when they went back to the States, and then eventually became as a more permanent detachment to Alconbury across in Northamptonshire. Eisenhower was concerned that these aircraft might be shot down or would cause a diplomatic incident, and of course it did eventually. In 1960, when Gary Powers was shot down in one on the 1st of May. Just to clarify what happened with him, he wasn't literally shot down at first. The Soviets had been trying desperately to shoot him down. Missiles couldn't reach, and one exploded below the aircraft, some distance below the aircraft, but it disrupted the airflow into the engine. It only had one engine, and that engine failed. And because of a lack of oxygen at altitude, he had to descend. And that was the downfall. He had to descend to try and relight his jet engine. That is when the missile got him, and he had to eject and was captured. And that caused, of course, a massive diplomatic incident. He was jailed, and eventually he was exchanged with Frederick Pryor and Rudolf Abel, the Russians, the Americans. So the RB-47 operating out of both Upper Heyford and Bryce Norton had a crew of 6. Normally it would have a crew of 3. Sometimes even only 2, a pilot and a co-pilot, bombardier up here with a bomb aiming position at the front. They put another capsule into the bomb bay here where there were a crew of 3. Again, lots and lots of listening devices under the aircraft. They could take photographs and they would interpret Soviet transmissions, radar, etc. One of these aircraft was flying along, and he was over the Bering Sea, wasn't even over the Baltic. And the co-pilot looked out and saw what impacted the pilot at the left-hand side. This is what he saw. He saw a MiG-19 literally on his wingtip. They didn't see him coming. There was no warning. The pilot pointed down. He tried to force the aircraft to descend. They refused, so he shot at them. And he knocked out 2 engines. The aircraft had 6 engines, but it wasn't going very far. And they, sorry, the word's gone. They ejected, that's the word. So they were flying. The blue is Soviet water, Soviet territory water. The white beyond it is international. They were in international airspace. They were intercepted here. They were shot at here. They ejected here, and the aircraft eventually crashed here. Sadly, 4 of the crew died, 2 survived. And those 2, well, they were able to provide this photograph and say what happened. This was July 1960. Gary Powers was shot down in March 1960. So why did they send aircraft up like this so soon afterwards? We don't know. It was lost, and some of the crew were lost. So the way this sort of intelligence is continuing obviously with satellites, it's continuing with aircraft on like this, but the Rivet Joint type aircraft. There is an aircraft right now over the Black Sea, listening to all the transmissions coming from Russia to determine what's happening in Ukraine, etc. So this type of recognition continues. So the growth from World War I handheld cameras to the current day is just unbelievable. So I'm moving on to interpreting the evidence. There's so much to talk about. Sorry, I'm going to keep moving fairly quickly. And what do we do when we have all this material? And of course, now we're getting more material than ever. A photographic interpretation, the act of examining photographic images for the purpose of identifying objects and judging their significance. We were looking during World War II for everything that the Nazis and the Italians, the Axis, were doing. We wanted to know absolutely as much as we could. And between photographic reconnaissance and signals interpretation, which had been done at Bletchley Park, a massive, well, virtually all the intelligence was, except for interrogating prisoners of war and spying, but by far the majority was being achieved by signals interpretation and by photo reconnaissance. The difference was at Bletchley Park, it took a while to actually decode signals, whereas the photographs coming back into Benson, Mount Farm and Chalgrove and the other bases was same day. They were being developed same day, they were being interpreted the same day. But between them, they shortened the war dramatically. World War I, back to there, maps could be made of the front line. This is no man's land between the trenches. With the maps, they could plot where the trenches were. They could see the German disposition. And of course, they could see ours. Here is a picture of the aircrew from 15 Squadron, Fighter Squadron in the World War One. The commanding officer, Major Summers, is here looking at aerial photographs with his pilots to determine what their targets are likely to be. And they, as I said before, they could map the whole of the Western Front in twice a day. And from the photographs, they made maps, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of maps. So if you're interpreting a photograph, what do you need to know? You need to know a lot, and it's a very skilled and very important job today, as much as it ever was. It has to be taught, and a huge amount is being developed. So the interpretation, we need to know the location, the exact location. Where is the photograph taken? What size is it? What is it? What's its shape? Is there any shadow which is going to help us determine its shape and size? Tone and colour of the ground. Is any of the ground contaminated? What's the ground used for? Texture, pattern, height and depth, the site, the situation, and its association with the surrounding area, and of course, time. So all those items go into looking at a photograph. And here we have a photograph taken in Allegheny River in Pennsylvania. And it's a river with a railway bridge. There's two railway lines coming into it. It crosses the river. This is obviously the most vulnerable point here if you're going to attack it. The railway line continues. There's a shed here which is curved. There's a turntable there, so clearly railway engines, locomotives, whatever can go into there. There are sidings here. There are buildings to the side. There is a hill over here. Are there guns, is weaponry in the area, or is this bridge protected? A lot to find out. So if you're interpreting and you're wanting to see what something is, you need to use a known object. So these are cars on an interstate. We know the size of a car. These are houses. We know the sizes of a house. So it's important that you have something to compare it with. Shadow is absolutely invaluable. So here we have a high-rise building. Without that shadow, you wouldn't even know what it was. It's just a square blob. With the shadow, it suddenly makes it into three-dimensional. This is the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. And again, take away that shadow, and you've just got a small blob. What is it? Similarly, pattern. This is RAF Church Fenton in Yorkshire. The hangars are camouflaged. They're very obvious from the air. You have the gridiron pattern of a military establishment, and they looked at all of these and they monitored them in Germany and occupied Europe to see if they were being modified and what use the airfields were, what aircraft were there, what equipment were there. Anything to do with ships and docks, you're going to have warehouses, you're going to have dry docks, as this is here. You're going to have associated things to go with water. We needed to know what was there, what is being imported, what is being exported, what are the ships carrying, are the ships being repaired, are they being modified? And there was expertise being built up in all these different styles. So there would be a particular group of people at Medmenham who would know everything about airfields, and everything that came into airfields would come into one particular group. Time and date is also critical. This is RAF Lucas up in Scotland. The photograph on the left is taken during World War II. The photograph on the right is taken much more recently. So here you have the hangars, which are the original hangars here, but huge, hard standing, massive more buildings, and the place has developed from a total command airfield to very much a fighter station. And these needed to be photographed regularly by the military, by the British and Americans, to determine what was going on. Not the RAF ones, although they did photograph them, but the ones in Europe. Now, the other major aid was stereoscope. And many of you will remember the Viewmaster 3D, where you had a circular card with photographs in, you slotted it into the top, you use a handle on the right-hand side to move them around, and the two photographs, when they were in the correct position, became three-dimensional. And this is a simple stereoscope, and these were used to bring aerial photographs into 3D. and that made them 100% more easy to interpret what you were looking at. This was developed initially by Sidney Cotter and his team in London, and you can see here, this is the very, very first briefing. The pilot's just landed. The photographs are being unloaded and being developed as fast as possible. And he, with the intelligence officer, is poring over the map to determine where he's been, what he's seen, and to be giving a verbal debrief while the photographs are being looked at, so they know if there's something specific, they know what to look at. And all this was centred here at Medmenham. Now, this is Danesfield House as it is today. It's a luxury hotel. I recommend it. You can walk in, or a few photographs in the lobby of it during the World War II. I'm going to show you those photographs. There is a beautiful orangery on the right-hand side with the view across the River Thames looking south, and you never ever know what its original purpose was. It was taken over because it was well away from Wembley, it was well away from London, not considered to be a target. Unfortunately, the Germans didn't seem to understand what it was. Well, here is the house itself, and a whole village of housing, of hutting was constructed round it. They kept the gardens because they were growing food, but there are huts here, there are huts here, there are huts here, and the RAF station itself was developed in this area off this plan, and it shows up better on here. This is the house. The River Thames is off to the right. It's located halfway between Henley and Marlow. All these huts were built here, especially, and then all this here were, these are post-war buildings being used for intelligence and signals. And these are marine quarters on the other side of the road. It became a very important place. There were over 2,000 people based here, and they were split into different groups having the different expertise. One of the other roles they took was to post bombing, to go and see after a bombing raid what damage had been caused by the bombers. And the photographs were provided to Bomber Command, so they knew how successful the raid was. It caused quite a few problems because they didn't believe the photographs in the early days because it showed so little damage, but things developed. But this photograph shows the house is here and the buildings scattered around, lots of trees, lots of camouflage to give it, and here. The Americans were offered to come and join with the British and a lot of Commonwealth people here as well from all different countries, Canada, Australia, and South Africa, as well as others. But we also invited the Americans because we cooperated with them and, of course, still do. And several American civilians came over to work here. They stayed as civilians until Pearl Harbor, when magically they appeared in uniform and suddenly they were our allies and continued to work together. And it was at that point, or after that point, that the two other airfields at Mount Farm and Chalgrove were developed and occupied by American squadrons after into 1943. Here you can see some of the gardens which were maintained for food. You can see the spread of the buildings going into the trees over here. And then the work inside was undertaken. Here is a lady, a WAF officer, using a stereoscope to look at photographs where you put two photographs side by side, get them into the correct position, and suddenly it'll pop up into three-dimensional. So the very first phase was done on the airfields when the aircraft landed. Photographs were developed, not necessarily printed, but developed and looked at, and then sent immediately across to Medmenham, where the second phase took place. And then the third phase was much long-term when they were comparing current photographs today, taken with ones taken some time previously. So very important all the way through. And a record was, obviously, every photograph was recorded, where, when, how, and a report was sent every single day to Churchill and to the ministries, the Navy, the Admiralty, the War Office, and the Air Ministry. Now, the machinery got somewhat more sophisticated than the small stereoscopes, and this is a Wild stereo autograph machine, which is Swiss. And we had two of these, and in fact, one of them was damaged in a bombing attack at Wembley, and it was disassembled, and the damaged parts were smuggled back to Switzerland, repaired or replaced, and brought back. But this, there is one at Chicksands, and if you get into the museum there by appointment, you can actually see it. It is very sophisticated, and they can draw maps from this as well as interpreting photographs. And maps were absolutely vital. Here we have a typical D-Day map. Many of them were much, much more detailed than this, but this is showing the disposition of troops 2 days after D-Day. But hundreds and hundreds of maps were produced by the photographic unit at Medmenham and the other 2 sites, because we just didn't have the detailed maps we needed, and we needed to know what was on the ground at that location now. Of course, the Germans did the same thing to us, but not as sort of sophisticated. This is our airport Vale near Liverpool. Southport is just off to the right there. This is the coastline, Lancashire coast. Liverpool is down this way. Formby town is here. This photograph was taken in 1941 by a German aircraft. There was a Spitfire, 2 Spitfire squadrons on the ground. They didn't even know that German aircraft was there. No radar in this part of the country at the time, and it was a beautiful, clear day, but the aircraft was so high it wasn't seen. So what do we do with these photographs? Well, here we have a lady who became very famous, one of the interpreters, and it was shown that ladies were more diligent at interpreting the photographs. It's a very broad generalization, I know, but they would not give up looking at a photograph to determine what was there. I'm definitely more diligent than the average man. And Constance is credited with discovering the V1 at Peenemünde in Germany, in North Germany, on the Baltic. She is quite a lady. We're going to hear more about her later. She was a milliner before the war, and she was an editor of Vogue magazine as well. And this looks like a Spitfire in the distance doing a fly past. In fact, it's attached to her hat. So it shows what a character she was. But she was a very, very diligent photographic interpreter. And what she found, this is what Peenemünde is on the Baltic coast. And this is a wartime photograph taken, which was one of the ones she would have looked at. It's a peninsula, it sticks out, the water goes all the way around it. In this bit here is where it's attached to the mainland. And she was looking down on what was on the ground. This is actually a V2 experimental launch site. And you can see the shadow of the equipment there. You can see here, this is quite a high building, and this is a high building as well, in a revetment in case of an explosion, as there may very well have been with a V2. The V1, you will know, a pilotless bomb. My wife and I had the pleasure of going to have a look at this place, and this just gives it scale. But the V1s were launched from Germany and France, particularly France, to England, and they were just provided with sufficient fuel to get over London. The fuel would run out, and then would just crash and explode. Very, very simple ramjet. But looking down from the air, Constance had great trouble. Everybody had trouble determining what is it. The shape was very unusual, and it was also going to be launched from what we call a ski ramp. And it was a ski ramp which probably showed it off more because it was bigger and an unusual shape. So she discovered that. That was discovered purely by photo reconnaissance. If they hadn't taken the photograph, we would never have known it was there. The V1 was attackable. We could send aircraft up, and lots were shot down, and lots had their wings. Fighting would fly alongside and just tilt the wings, and the V1 would spin down out of control. Sadly, that could not happen to a V2, and the V2. This is one, obviously, being a trial one being launched. Once they were launched, there was no defence against these. The only defence was to attack them before they took off. So the other things which the interpreters were looking at, the achievements they made, the dams. This is the Mona Dam before the attack, taken by a photo reconnaissance Spitfire. And here it is after the attack, a couple of days later, showing very, very clearly that they had been breached and that the raid was successful. So post-attack and pre-attack. Another thing they did, as well as making maps for D-Day, they wanted to know exactly what the defences were along the coast of Normandy. They couldn't just concentrate on Normandy, they had to concentrate on the whole of the occupied coastline. But this is a typical coastline photograph of Normandy. On the original, you can see people lying in the mud here, throwing himself flat, one running out of the way here, because it's a Spitfire flying at very, very low level down the beach, taking these photographs at low tide so they could see just what was there in preparation for D-Day. They call this dicing, very low level flying, dicing, dicey, so probably where the phrase comes from. This is another example of the achievements. This is a photograph by one photographic reconnaissance unit at Benson on the 5th of December 1941, and it shows a small French chateau and a blob here. And that blob is a radar unit on the coast. And it was a returning photo reconnaissance pilot. He was flying at higher level. He looked down, he saw this, he didn't know what it was, so he went down to investigate and he took this photograph. And from that photograph, the scientists determined it was a radar unit. They also decided they needed it. They wanted to know what it was and to learn from it. So they wanted to raid it. And this is where Medmenham and Phyllis Court come into play. This is the photograph. This is a model. And they built a model of the house, the radar unit, and the cliffs down to the coast. And they sent paratroopers over with scientists, and they parachuted immediately adjacent to the chateau. There were only a few Germans there. They were not anticipating being attacked. They were very, very quickly overwhelmed. The scientists dismantled the radar unit. There was a submarine waiting off the coast. There were boats waiting at the bottom of the cliffs. They abseiled down the cliffs with this radar unit in bits and disappeared way before the Germans knew what was going on. Now, the beauty of these models is once they were made, they made a master model. They then put a rubber solution over the top of them. And from the one master mold, they could run off as many copies as they wanted. And they could give the troops a copy of this, and they could literally fold it up and put it in their pocket and take it away with them. And they had a picture of where they were going to attack. And this type of work was undertaken at Medmenham, but also there wasn't enough space for Phyllis Court. So Phyllis Court is now a country club. It was a very substantial house on the River Thames, just like Medmenham. This is how it looks today, certainly not during the war. This is quite a nice photograph of a couple of American officers taken in 1944 and school kids. Phyllis Court is just behind the trees over there. This is looking downriver from the bridge. And this is a model maker here, Flight Lieutenant Steve Waring. He's working on a model. You can see a model behind him. He's using a stereoscope. He's using photographs, and he's building a model out of sand and plasticine and plaster and whatever is available. And here's another example of them doing it. They needed more and more space. There wasn't space at Medmenham. They expanded into Phyllis Court. They also expanded to Hewington Manor, which was Disraeli's personal home at the time he was Prime Minister. And here they started making maps, and maps from photographs like this, which were created into maps like this. And inside Hewington Manor, you had lovely surroundings, drawing boards where male and female map makers were making maps for hundreds and hundreds of maps, which were then printed off and used by the invading troops. Here back at Medmenham, we've got interpreters again. They've got interlocking, overlapping photographs here mounted on the wall, maps of Europe on the wall to help them go through the interpretation. A lot of this work was done not in the house, but in the huts around. Nearly there. All the photographs had to be printed, and this was a mammoth job. The daily intake by 1945 was something in the region of 25,000 negatives. And from those, 60,000 prints were being made and distributed. And by the end of the war, it's estimated 36 million prints had been made. These are the figures. They were massive. And what we didn't know about what was going on in the Nazi-occupied areas was hardly worth knowing. So here we have a group of happy WAF interpreters and one happy man there in the background. There were a real mixture of men and women there, obviously many liaisons, but they worked 24 hours a day. They didn't talk about what they were doing. They were very, very specialist in their field, and there were some very well-known people there. Sarah Churchill's own daughter, was there, and she was an interpreter. And she would go and see him, and he'd say, well, what's going on? And she'd say, well, I can't tell you, it's secret. And they'd have quite a few little battles between them. I think they were both very tough people. There was also Bonham Carter, Helen Bonham Carter was there. And between these sort of people, they knew a lot of actors and actresses from the West End, and they would bring shows into Medmenham as a bit of light relief. And finally, seeing it's Christmas, well, almost finally, this is the menu at Oriel Medmenham for 1943 Christmas. And it's roast Medmenham pork as well as roast Irish turkey and all the trimmings. So Christmas was always absolutely vital. Everybody had to have a Christmas lunch, and it was all served by the officers. That, in a nutshell, is what was happening in Oxfordshire. Interestingly, right now at Duxford, there is an exhibition known as Spies in the Skies about Second World War aerial reconnaissance, and it's on from just after Christmas until the end of February. Once you get into Duxford and you pay the entry, this is free entry to go into. So there is no photographic interpretation or flights flying anymore from Oxfordshire, sadly, but the role is going on. It's being undertaken in other ways by aircraft, by drones, and by satellites. And of course, our major adversary is not only Russia, but now we have China we have to be extremely careful with. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's a very quick run through. I hope it's given you an understanding of Oxfordshire's absolutely vital role, not only in World War II, but also in the Cold War. Thank you.
Well done, Alden. Thank you very much indeed. That was a tour de force, Alden. You covered an enormous amount of ground, and we're very grateful to you. In fact, we went into all sorts of areas I wasn't expecting to go at all, Alden. But you've given us a fantastic description of the vital work done by those brave men, particularly the men, in gathering the intelligence, and the men and women, of course, who did perform the vital interpreting of these photographs. So thank you very much indeed. I'm very glad to be able to tell people tonight that you've heard mention of Constance Babington Smith. And it's a particular treat, actually, for me to be able to introduce you to her nephew, Jamie. Jamie Babington Smith, who I hope you've now got on your screen, has very kindly offered to tell us a bit more about this very interesting lady, this enigmatic lady, this very colourful lady, Constance Babington Smith. And I would like just to pay a tribute, Jamie, through you, to your brother Hugh Babington Smith, who was the project officer for the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum in Woodstock. He was in at the ground floor, and it's through him, Jamie, that we've run you to ground. And we're very pleased to have done so. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I wonder if you could take up the story a little bit about Constance.
Right, yes, certainly. Well, one thing I would like to say right at the very beginning is that Constance was one of many at Medmenham. She was very lucky in some ways that she became the subject of publicity, but in other ways she rather regretted it. She was actually quite a humble person, and was very embarrassed by some of the American reviews of her work in 1945, which we'll talk about a bit later. She came from a very large family with 7 siblings. She was the second youngest. Like many of her background, she was educated at home, and she only had a year's formal education at a finishing school in France. She was always a very enthusiastic writer. At the age of 7 or 8, she was writing the family newspaper daily. And once she had finished her finishing school, she announced that she wished to work for a milliner. Not any old milliner, but one in Mayfair. And she was apprenticed there and worked very hard at that. But she maintained her interest in writing and started writing for Vogue. At the same time, she developed a considerable fascination with aircraft. She put out the nose of the Secretary of the Royal Aeronautical Society at the age of 12 by writing to tell them that they had got something wrong in one of their articles. And very soon afterwards, she started writing for the aeroplane. The story always was that she wrote about hats for aeroplane and aeroplanes for Vogue, but that was rather apocryphal. But writing for aeroplane introduced her to the world of aviation, and in the years before the war, she went on the circuit of all the big air shows all around Europe, and that meant she met many of the leaders in the aviation world, which were going to help her in future life. At the beginning of the war, she joined the Women's Air Force and became a teleprinter operator. But then there was a call for people to work with photography, and she answered the call and was commissioned in December 1940 and went to work in Wembley. As a result of her interest in aircraft on her own bat, she proceeded to edit and produce a recognition manual for Italian aircraft. And this so impressed her superiors that she was then asked to found and run a section concerned with aircraft. This was unusual. There was only one other female section leader, Ursula Powys-Libb, who paradoxically ran the airfield section for 2 years. The section was responsible for the study of new aircraft and their research and development facilities, production facilities, factories, and airfields. Its achievements were many. They included the identification of new aircraft, particularly the new generation of jet aircraft, the rocket-propelled Messerschmitt 163, which was first seen at Peenemünde, and then the V1. The identification of dispersed and underground aircraft factories for aircraft production. And this, together with the work on the normal factories, produced a significant input into the assessment of production rates. And by 1944, the British were able to accurately assess all aircraft production in Germany. Her contacts, her pre-war contacts in both service and civilian fields proved absolutely invaluable. And she was not afraid to go and talk to anyone who might help her in her quest, sometimes to the irritation of her seniors. She was actually totally dedicated to her task. Her brother who also served at Medmenham, once said that, most PIs at Medmenham worked at about 75% efficiency. The better ones worked at about 80%. She worked at 95% efficiency. One of her staff told me once that they would be sitting around chatting and she would turn up and that was it. Everyone was back at the desk and not a word would be said. Her brother told me that he would go and wait for her after the end of his shift, and someone would come out and say, "Oh, go in and see her. She's just go." No, I'll wait. I wouldn't like to disturb her. This was typical. When I was a child, you never rang Constance in the morning because she was busy writing books, and if you did, you got your head chewed off. The afternoon was fine, but the morning was sacred. And that was her. She was absolutely dedicated to her work. She wasn't an ogress. She had a lovely sense of humor, but she was completely focused. She managed to establish very close liaison, both with the Air Ministry. She'd be frequently up there briefing them on what was happening, and also very particularly with the OSS section in the US Embassy, headed by Walt Rostow. And the section's targeting was of a major benefit to the US Air Force's bombing campaign of aircraft factories. And so Constance was awarded the MBE for her work on the V1 at Peenemünde and the Legion of Merit for her work on the bombing campaign against aircraft. In early 1945, she was one of a major team sent to the Pentagon to help US intelligence in the war in Japan. And she worked there until 1946 when she was finally discharged and went off to do other things. In 1986, the American Photogrammetric Association invited Constance to go to their annual convention to be guest of honor there. NPIC, the American Photographic Agency, learned of her coming and invited her to go to address them. And they presented the cartoon, which I hope you'll see on the screen, of her coming. About 10, 15 years later, after her death, I received her miniature medals. I wasn't sure what to do with them for a time, but then I decided that actually, given the contacts she had with the States, the work she'd done with the States, the regard with which she was held in the States, that was their natural home. And I was very pleased that Jarek took the project on and produced a portrait of her with her medals mounted in the bottom. And this was presented to NPIC at the time and is now in the National Geospatial Agency's Hall of Fame, where she was the first Commonwealth woman to be made a member of that Hall of Fame. So I hope that gives a feeling of Constance, who was a wonderful person. It was a sad day when she died, but she made so much to so many people. Thank you.
You made a tremendous contribution, and thank you very much for bringing that to life for us tonight, Jamie. It was really very good to hear all this. I think in the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, we're very proud of our association with Constance at a distance, of course, for this reason, because she played such an important role in the war, and also that we've got this link with your family through the museum, which is splendid. So thank you very much indeed for that. a fascinating talk. Now, I've got a couple of questions coming in here. First of all, from Henry Spielberg, Alden, who's one of our trustees. What a fascinating talk. Thank you. How interesting to hear about the work Constance Babington Smith. Very insightful. Can I ask what kind of technical training the photographic interpreters received? Do we know about that?
I don't know whether Jamie is better to answer this than me, actually. They were trained.
They were trained. Yes. Training was carried out at Nuneham Park, just south of Oxford.
Yep.
And they did I think it was a 2-week course. And they all did that. And of course, it was very much a learning curve. And at the stage at which people like Constance joined, it was a basic. The army actually had a photographic interpretation course before the war. They continued producing photographic interpreters between the wars, and it was based on that course.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. And an observation from Tim Burt. I know Tim from the Royal Commonwealth Ex-Services League. Tim, good evening. Thank you for covering the photographic interpretation work of Medmenham and the model making at Phyllis Court and map making at Hughenden Manor, so often overlooked and in the shadow of the code-breaking Bletchley Park. Yes, that's an interesting observation to make. You showed Bletchley Park as well, of course. Alden, a question here from Fiona asking about the Royal Air Force continuing with the Spitfire, or did they, after the introduction of the Mosquito?
No, they did continue with the Spitfire right the way through and after the war, in fact. They were so well advanced with those Spitfires that they did just as good a job. So there were so many of them, and they needed so many of them because many of the sorties they did were aborted because of bad weather. So yes, they kept them both. But they probably, I don't know what the numbers were towards the end of the war, but certainly the squadrons at Benson were still operating Spitfires at the end of the war. And in fact, 3 of those Mark 19s were the very last Spitfires to fly routine RAF operations when they formed part of a meteorological flight called the Thumb Flight. And it was 1957 before the last Photo Reconnaissance Spitfires actually were given up regular flying, and they became the nucleus of the Battle of Britain Memorial flight. And all 3 of them are still flying.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that. A question here from Vanessa, really about what happened at Medmenham after the war. It was obviously a hugely important place during the war. What happened afterwards?
It became the headquarters of Signals Command. And as I was trying to explain with the Cold War, we were looking at other things. Well, we had been during the war, but it became much more important in the Cold War to be looking at radar systems, radio emissions, and really what Bletchley Park were doing as well. But these flights were soaking up information. They would try and encourage the Soviets to switch a radar unit on. And if it did, then they could determine where it was, what frequency it was working on, and approximately what range that radar had. And this was vital for planning the bombing routes. If we were going to have a deterrent, we had to have a route whereby our V-bombers and the American deterrent bombers could hopefully get through the radar protection the Soviets had. So we were pinpointing constantly the location of these. And we found initially that the radar units were operating individually. They weren't linked together. They didn't communicate, and there were gaps. And that was how we were targeting where the bombers were going to go. So Medmenham was coordinating all that and operating aircraft out of Watton in Norfolk.
Yes, I know. Yep.
the aircraft were getting more and more sophisticated. Eventually, the command was downgraded to be a group called 90 Group, which was a signals and intelligence group. And they stayed there. Date-wise, it must have been 60s, early 60s, before that went to Whitton, and the whole operation, not to Whitton, to Brampton, to Jarwick. And the Central Photographic Unit operated alongside with Jarwick at Brampton in Northamptonshire. And then eventually, the last thing Medmenham did, it became a police dog training centre, which was a pretty basic. I didn't really think what they did. The Marine quarters are all retained by RAF High Wycombe. The airmen's quarters have been sold off and redeveloped, but behind there are a lot of Marine quarters. And the house was taken over by Carnation.
Foods people.
Yes. Carnation sort of evaporated milk and this sort of thing. They operated as their head office for a while. It was then sold to a hotel group. It suffered 2 terrible fires. Just how genuine the fires were, I don't know, but certainly a lot of damage was done. Eventually, the current owners picked it up, rebuilt the damaged areas. It's now a very successful and very nice hotel.
In your talks, both of you tonight have mentioned Jarwick. Can you just remind me what Jarwick stands for?
Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Centre.
Splendid. Thank you very much indeed. Before going on, we've got some more questions coming in. Before going on, can I just make a plea to everybody remaining on the call tonight on the Q&A? Please think generously about making a donation to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum tonight. Thanks to the sponsorship by Martin Baker, all your donations will come to the museum, I'm very pleased to say, so that we can continue making films like this and continue running the museum. And they make a tremendous difference to us. So please think generously about SOFO as you go on with this Q&A tonight. You can make a donation via the red button at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or by texting the word RECON to 70450 with the amount you want to donate. And we'd really appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed. We've got a comment here from Richard Hill, which I think will interest both of you. Thank you very much for your talk. My father was with 11 MAP Repro unit in the 8th Army in North Africa and Italy. It's been very interesting to learn more of what he did during the war. And I'm sure that's thrown quite a lot of light for a lot of people in that sort of way. Richard Cooksey has got a question for you, which I think is an interesting one. In World War II, was there a system for trying to find random things in photographs, random items in photographs, and also to take bigger photographs to see what random things may be anywhere? Or did they randomly spot things like rockets by chance? I mean, in a way, you've answered that, I suppose, by describing the Bruneval raid.
Well, the quality of photographs grew with the improvement in cameras. And it all obviously hinged on the weather, but the actual quality of the photographs got better, and in the interpretation skills improved dramatically with experience of a number of people involved. So the individual groups, as Jamie mentioned, so you had one like Constance looking purely at aircraft, others looking at all sorts of different things. In fact, there's a story about one who was following a circus, and the wife interpreter exclaiming when she saw a baby elephant had been born and had been actually following what the circus was doing. So the detailing I got into was incredible. So they were certainly alert to random scenarios. If something, like, for instance, for V2 launch sites, a lot of them were being built in the forests in northern France. And so you'd have a pad which would suddenly appear. And so they were very anxious to know where and what they were, because they had to monitor those, so that if a V2 appeared on one, they had to try and get them before they were actually launched. And they had to disperse them because we were getting so good at destroying them. So interesting question. And I think as the Germans had to develop building underground and dispersing the construction sites like we did. We spread our manufacture of aircraft and war equipment into the tiniest of little establishments. So we did everything we possibly could to find out what was going on the ground. And the different departments did talk to each other, and they did interrelate professionally, as well as doing specific reports on specific targets constantly.
Thank you very much.
24 hours a day.
Yep,
Could I just say that? Sorry, could I quickly say that the first phase was basically the point at which people looked for strange things. So first phase would identify something that was odd that they hadn't seen before, and that would then trigger a further sortie to look for it. And that would then be, once they had identified what the activity was, then it would then be passed to the relevant third phase section to actually analyze in full detail.
Good. Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Henry Spielberg is being busy tonight. He says, good to hear mention of Adrian Warburton. Thank you very much for him. As one of the PR pilots, he went to St Edward's School in Oxford, as did Douglas Bader and Guy Gibson. For a short time, I think he flew PR Lightnings from Mount Farm. Can you confirm that, Alden? Do you know that?
Not to my knowledge. He did obviously fly from the UK early on, but the majority of his work was out of Malta. So maybe, but I am not aware of that.
Tim Fryer has come in with a question a moment ago about Warburton. Following a car accident, he was grounded by the Royal Air Force, but scrounged a flight with the Americans and didn't return.
Well, about his knowledge, it is quite likely he was absolutely determined to do everything he could and to improve everything he did. He would take off when he shouldn't be. He would be taking off an aircraft which were not suitable for the role. But he was so dedicated and so successful. He was almost invincible. It was almost sort of unbelievable in the end that he should have been lost. It's very sad if he was lost in a way like that.
Yeah. A comment from Phil Wilkinson, who's well known to the soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum because he gave us our splendid talk earlier in the year about the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and their remembrance work. Good to hear of the respective squadrons of the PRU, not least in their efforts, Spitfire and Mosquito, in the hunt for an eventual sinking of the Tirpitz, including all the deployments and operations to and from Archangel. So that was another point. Thank you very much indeed. Charles Hamshaw Thomas has got a question here. Do you know why aerial reconnaissance, which had progressed quite a lot in World War I, I think everyone was amazed to see how quickly it improved in World War I, why was it disbanded at the end of the war? It looks a very strange decision and was probably, I guess, purely financial.
Everything was disbanded. The Air Force was shrunk down to a minimum of squadrons and very little development. The aircraft of 1936, we were still flying Hayfords, biplane bombers out of Oxfordshire airfields like Bicester and Abingdon. They were archaic. We believed that was a war to end all wars, we hoped. And there was no money, there was no will to put money into the military. I think we're probably in a similar position at the moment, quite honestly.
Yeah. Richard Cooksey again, was there a good system for filing photographs? And so changes and movements, etc., over time could be tracked. And I guess that was essential, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Every single photograph was recorded, annotated, where, when, what, and they were recoverable. So even now, that happens. And of course, the amount of material which is coming down in real time is massive. But yes, they were very, very carefully catalogued. I mean, Jarek had a gigantic library of photographs.
Yeah. That's good. Thank you very much indeed. David King, also known to me, delighted to hear that you're on the call tonight, David. Good evening. Alden mentioned 42,000 feet as the Spitfire altitude. Is that right?
That was the highest it could reach, yes.
Okay. And Michael Treble has got a question here. I believe quite a few photographic reconnaissance pilots were killed during missions during the war. What was the cost, actually?
I can't answer that, and I should. There is a museum at Benson, and Mick, who runs that, would know the answer to this. The cost was quite high. The problem was these pilots operated, certainly on the Spitfires, obviously alone, hence their motto, alone, unarmed, and unafraid. They didn't fly in pairs or fours, they flew individually. So they would take off, and if they didn't come back, chances are we'd never know what happened to them. In many cases, we just don't know. It could be mechanical failure, it could be structural failure, they could be shot down, it could be at altitude that for some reason the oxygen supply fails, in which case they're going to crash. If they crash into the sea and there's no wreckage visible, then there's just no way we know where they are. All we know is they didn't survive. And the only way is to go through the squadron records and actually put that information together. But it's something I really should find out, because I think people are interested. It's a good question.
Yes, it's always nice to be able to know where people are remembered. That's the other thing. If they made a particular contribution in an area, it's nice to know how and where they are remembered.
Well, anyone who has an unknown grave, any military RAF who has an known, as the gentleman would have told you, who came from the Commonwealth War Grave Commission, is at Runnymede, the Air Force's memorial at Runnymede. There, every, not necessarily aircrew, but every person in the RAF who was killed during the war without a known grave, a name is remembered at Runnymede. That's open to the public free of charge.
Friars come back in saying about pilot losses. Look at the AA810 website. Is that familiar to you? Just Google AA810.
Yes. Yeah, it's a matter then of determining who is a PR pilot and who isn't. You'd have to work through the squadron.
Yeah. I've got a question. I've got a Nicholas Watkins. Is it Watkins, I think. In order to Hampshire Thomas question, the Royal Air Force was responsible for cameras, the Army for interpretation. At the end of the war, without a particular need, the Army retained photo interpretation in India. Does that make sense to you?
We're talking about the Second World War, I assume.
No, the First World War.
First World War. Good question. I can't answer that. Clearly, as we saw with the crew from 15 Squadron, there was no professional interpretation at all. They were given the photographs, and that was down to the aircrew and the squadron commander to determine what those photographs showed. It did develop, but whether it was purely Army, I can't believe it was 100% Army on the Western Front during the First World War. But I stand to be corrected.
Well, at the end of the war, he says, without a particular need, the Army retained photo interpretation in India. I think he's talking about India, yeah?
Oh, okay. Well, basically, the RAF almost ceased to exist in India, as they did in most of these places. Okay. They just withdrew. Okay. And it wasn't really till we were looking at the threat of war that we started to build up the Air Force in these places. So yes, I'm sure he's right.
I'm going to make this the last question because I think it's one that is germane to this business about remembrance. Tim Fryer's come in with about Tim in response to Tim Burt's question. No, or is it Tim Burt who's come in? I'm getting muddled up with all this. Here we are. It's Tim Burt who's come back in. He says, in November 2021, the House of Commons debated a national memorial to the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. Does anyone know of any progress on this?
I'm not aware of any specific memorial. There isn't one at Alrawas.
Yes, you mean at the National Memorial Arboretum?
Yes, there isn't one there. As far as I'm not aware of a national one in any way, but I would say to everybody, particularly because it's in Oxfordshire, but at Benson, there is a museum which is located alongside the officers' mess. It's prior permission only. You can't, it's by appointment. It's a porter cabin. 50% of it is photo reconnaissance. And the other 50% is Benson and the Queen's flight, the royal flight information. But it's full of PR information. And Mick Prendergast, who runs it, is full of PR information as well. He is an amazing character. I can pass his contact details to anybody who's interested. It is well worth going to. It's a fascinating place, and he'll keep you involved and interested in PR for as long as you like.
Well, I think as a follow-up to this talk, Alden, if you could tell us for the museum about the museum at the collection really at Benson and how it can be accessed and roughly when and the contact details, that would be very interesting, and we'll put it on the website for people.
Good idea. I'll chat with Mick. I'm sure he'll be happy with that, certainly.
We've had a very good discussion tonight, and it's gone on, and there's more questions coming in. But I'm going to draw it to a close now, because I think we have exhausted our speakers, particularly you, Alden, who have hardly drawn breath for the last whatever. I know you're prone to this now. I'm getting the measure of you now, Alden. But thank you very much indeed, Alden, for that, and also to you, Jamie. In coming to an end tonight, I'd like to make a few remarks about thanks, really, to people for getting all this together. First of all, to Clive Smith, our filmmaker and editor, and to the Army Flying Museum at Middle Wallop, who introduced us to Clive in the first place. I'd like to reiterate our thanks, please, to our terrific sponsor, Martin Baker, Aircraft Company Limited, who sponsored this talk. And as I said earlier in the evening, it's thanks to their generosity that means that when you make a donation, and I hope you have felt able to do so and have wanted to do so, we are able to keep those donations for the running of the museum, which makes a tremendous amount of difference to us. Our speakers tonight have been fantastic. Alden, thank you very much indeed. You are a practiced hand as far as this is concerned with the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. Well done indeed, and thank you very much indeed to Jamie as well for joining us from your home in Scotland. It's very good to meet you on the like this, to meet Hugh Babington Smith's brother. And I'd like to present you, Jamie, if you're happy to accept it, with a special prize from the museum, which is this book by Simon Harris, which is a Great War history of the 2nd Battalion of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, known at the time as the 52nd Light Infantry, and it's their story in the Great War. You may wonder why their story wasn't written sooner, but it's a very well-written, modern story. It's beautifully researched. There are magnificent photographs, magnificent maps, and the story couldn't be more sensitively or carefully told. And I'm just going to read to you what one friend of mine, who is also an amateur historian, Jonathan Cheel won't mind me describing him as an amateur historian, but he said, as a result of reading this book, magnificent, an absolute triumph. And this was a note to the writer, to the author. I have loved reliving the regiment's experience. You write, Simon, with an ability to bring the reader right into the atmosphere, and I feel I've actually met some of the participants. So this is an unusual book, Jamie, and I hope you'll be pleased to receive it by post from us as the days go on.
Thank you. That would be excellent. Add to my collection. Thank you very much indeed.
We're delighted, and thank you very much for your contribution. Looking forward, the museum will be closed between the 20th of December and the 2nd of January. Thursday, the 25th of January, is our Veterans Coffee and Chat morning between 10 o'clock and 12 o'clock, which is a regular feature in our monthly calendar, happens the last Thursday of every month. And the aim is to encourage veterans from the counties of Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire and anywhere around, really, anywhere around, to come and meet others who gather at the museum at that time, and we'll very much look forward to welcoming you then. Also that evening, we've got our next online talk, Thursday, the 25th of January. This is an online talk by Professor Andrew Hopper, Professor of Social and Local History in the Department for Continuing Education at the University of Oxford. The talk is about the English Civil War in Oxfordshire, but it covers an unusual aspect of it. Andrew is the principal investigator in a Civil War's petitions project, which has revealed the hidden voices of those really deeply affected by the appalling tragedy of the Civil War in the 17th century. The project uncovers some very sobering human stories about the conflict, but also tales of survival and hope. So it ends on a slightly upbeat note, I'm glad to be able to say. But it's a very interesting and unusual dimension to the Civil War, and I hope it will appeal to you and that you'll be able to tell people about it. Thank you again for joining us tonight. And in wishing you good night, I also wish you a peaceful and enjoyable Christmas. Good night.